Ashe and welcome. I'm Amanda Rutland, Muscogee Creek and Seminole artist, and today I'm going to teach you a little bit about how I do block printing. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the symbolism I use in my stamps and how I got started. I grew up south of I-40 in the southern part of the Muscogee Creek Reservation. My tribal town is Mvskoke, and I attended a traditional church. And as I got older and started going around, I wanted to be able to incorporate a lot of our Mississippian and mound builder symbolism into our clothing like we see many of the other tribes doing. Primarily you think about Plains tribes and things like that, but I wanted something that was uniquely southeastern. And so I started on a quest of how to get these designs onto my fabric, and I settled on block printing. I work with a standard rubber material. There are other options. You can cut linoleum or other things. I like rubber because it's durable, it's easy to cut, it's easy to clean. Some of the symbols that I've used in the past, these are some of our Mississippian symbols that I talked about. Of course, incorporating balance and the number 4, which is important to us in our sacred way. But more recently, I've actually carved some things for the Muscogee Creek Nation. This is the Perpetual Blessings symbol that the Muscogee royalty uses. And so it was a fun little thing to incorporate. But going into that, let's get started. Let's go over some materials. Of course, I talked a little bit about my media that I work with. You can get these at standard craft stores, you can get them at Michael's, you can get them on Amazon, Dick Blick, things like that. So you need your cutting material, you need your cutter, which that's what these are. I use this little speed ball, and it has different size tips that do different cuts, different sizes. I have 3 or 4 different sizes here. I have what's called a brayer that helps me both distribute my paint or my ink onto my stamp, and it also helps press it into my fabric. So the other things that you need are a type of paint or ink to get started. There are a few different ones. Speedball makes this fabric block printing ink. You do not have to heat set this, but it does take time to cure, and you have to set like a week to cure on it. The other options you can use, and I like to use screen printing ink. You heat set this and you're done. Now make sure that it does say fabric on it. There are other screen printing inks that are just for paper, so make sure it does say fabric on it. It comes in a wide variety of colors. I have black, white, gold, there's even glow in the dark, so there's no limit to the amount of things you can come up with. And then of course you'll need your tracing paper to get your image onto the material. And today I thought that I would work with a series of a few different ones. I have this little raccoon from one of our sites. I can't actually remember which site this was discovered at the moment, but maybe Mark can follow up in the description with text or something. So let's get started. So I'm gonna lay it on this so it's a little bit steadier. Something to press. I like my lines to be thick. All right, so there we have it. There's our design. So now we'll take it and position it on our rubber. So I position this toward the outside edge so that I don't have any area wasted. And I just use my finger at this point and just rub over it to transfer. So at this point, what I usually do is I get my Sharpie and go over the design actually on the rubber so that it's a little bit darker and I don't smudge it. So I finished tracing the outline, and now what I usually do is I go ahead and trim this out from the block so that I don't waste any of my excess materials. So what we'll get ready to do now is to actually cut our design. And what I usually do is I start with a very middle size tip. I usually like to use on the speedball stamp carving tool. I use a number 2, and it has this very small V tip that helps you have a lot of control to begin with. I don't cut my thick lines first, I cut my middle lines first. So that way I start with the outline and I work my way in, ending with the very smallest details. So to install this, I just slide it in, and push down, make sure it's good and attached, and we'll get started. This is the number 2 that I was mentioning with the V cut. And as you can see, we have our design here. Now I'm going to cut around and remove the rubber from around the image, and then we'll talk a little bit about design choices here. So this is how I like to get started, with just going around the edges. I don't go all the way to the edge just yet, but I kind of work my way into it. So I just start out slow, going around the edges, taking my time. You want to take your time and really breathe through everything, because if you accidentally slip and take off too much, there's no putting it back. So I got that one whole curve. Now I'm going to come in a little closer. Kind of just, sometimes these get a little stuck. So now I'm going to reverse and come up from the bottom. Being easy, just taking my time. And your first cuts don't have to be perfect. We can smooth them out a little bit more as we go along. I don't know, I find it really relaxing. Something about that repetitiousness of the tool through the rubber. And I can go a little faster as I just remove some of the excess away. I really like the two-toned rubber squares because it helps you to see how far down you actually need to cut for it to be accurate and a deep image. So So as I shave off the edge, I actually put the very side of the V right there, and then kind of push it through. So see how it angles it off a little bit more? That's for the control on the edge. If you're carving and it gets a little bit hard to go, pull back a little and release just a little bit of pressure and it'll come off. Because usually at that point it's that the tool is trying to cut too deep into the rubber for it to flow smoothly. So we're getting closer. Being done with the outside edge here. Oops. See what happens when you don't go just as slow? It got the edge of the ear here, so I have to be really careful. I'll round it out in our later portion. So even if you do make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. It's important that we cut away all the extra from around our image, because if we don't, these ridges will get paint or ink or whatever medium we're working with and distribute onto your surface. So actually what I like to do is I get closer to being completed. I just actually go ahead and take my X-Acto knife and I just cut around it, because I like all of mine to have just go right up to the edge of the image. So if I'm stamping multiple times, I can see exactly where it's gonna go. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. It's just something I like to do. Try to get this piece without cutting myself. And really, just scoring it a little and pulling is usually good enough. Just take off a little extra up top. And as we start to get into our design here, we have some decisions we need to make. In that, how do we want the stamp to function? Do we want it to be just an outline, or if we want it to be solid? So at this point, I think I actually just want this to be an outline. So I'm gonna start cutting out the center and just leaving the lines behind. Or you can choose to alternate and do it any way you want. You can leave segments of the tail or something different. But to keep myself reminded here, I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of mark off the segments that I'm actually gonna be carving on, that I'm gonna cut away for reference, so I don't get confused as I'm cutting. Because that can happen, and then it results in a reverse image, which can be pretty cool. I actually did that on this early stamp. And so if I'm using it, whatever color I'm stamping, in this case, the last color I used was white and red. And then what's left behind is the image in the negative space. So we're not gonna do that this time. We're gonna work on cutting the outlines. I do the majority of my cutting all with the same tip. For the cutter, I mean. Sometimes I will go into the smaller tips, like this one. It's very tiny as compared to this one, as we get further along. I like this one because it's wide and easy to control. I find that the thinner cutting pieces are a little harder to use, harder to control. So at this point, I finished up carving. This is what he looks like, my little wood cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a test stamp and make sure that we've cut away all of the little grooves in here and that the paint or the ink doesn't build up. So I have my screen printing ink over here on my surface. Now if you don't have one of these, that's fine. You can use paper plate, you can use something kind of plastic, just whatever you have. It doesn't have to be fancy. So this helps me spread the paint or ink on this evenly. I'm gonna do some back and forth, side to side, make sure it's good and coated, but we don't want too much. So I'm gonna let it set here just a second before I adhere this, because right out of the tub, this can be kind of slick, and sometimes you have to let it sit for a few seconds to get sticky. Okay, so before we test this on this, I have a piece of newspaper here so that I don't make mistakes on my good fabric. So I have it face down. I'm going to take my other brayer and just go over it with a little bit of pressure. Even pressure, going back and forth. I'm going to remove this now and see what it looks like. It looks like I didn't wait long enough for my ink to get tacky, and when you do that, it can kind of smudge. So I know this is a bit hard to see on camera, especially white on white, but it's kind of smudged a little bit on this. It's the outline smudged. So we're gonna let it get tacky and do another adhesion and another test before we move forward. We're gonna let that set for a few seconds, maybe 5 or 10. Not enough for it to fully dry, but enough for it to get sticky, and that way we don't have as much sliding, the stamp sliding around on the surface. So fan that just a little bit more. Yeah, I think we're good. It stuck to my finger and didn't move too much, so I'm gonna do just a slight bit more, make sure everything's good and coated evenly. Okay, now I'm gonna put it here on the dark part so we can kind of see how this is doing. Already, I think this is doing better. Perfect, just about. So this is an idea of what it should look like. I'm really happy with this, but it looks like there are a couple spaces in the tummy area that I can look at over here where the ink stood up. So I'm gonna cut those down and then we'll be good to go. There we have it. I'll turn this around so the camera can see. And this is our final product right here. I'm gonna heat set it. To make sure the ink adheres. Each ink has different setting instructions based upon the manufacturer's guidelines, so be sure and check whichever ink or paint that you are using to make sure that you have it set well. So make sure you heat set your stuff based upon the manufacturer's guidelines for your paint or ink. So I appreciate you joining me today, and I hope that I've inspired you to feel that you can tackle this project and start block printing for yourself. Thanks, and Mvto.
This program was brought to you by the Muscogee Creek Nation, the Muscogee Creek Nation Cultural and Archives Center, the Muscogee Creek Nation Public Relations and Communications Department. Special thanks to Amanda Rutland, Siobhan Agee, John Beaver, John Brown, and Alicia Ballard.